Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dania Dhafar. I'm the Executive Director of Gulf International Forum. Thank you so much for joining us today. What a wonderful mix of old friends of GIF and new faces. Welcome to all the new attendees. It is my privilege to introduce this extraordinary panel on a very timely issue titled Iran, the Gulf, and the USA, Causes and Consequences of War Drums. In the past several weeks, we have witnessed a rise in tensions between the US and Iran, a relationship that only a few years ago seemed to be reaching a positive breakthrough for the first time in decades. Instead of continuing to build on the ties that seemed possible due to the groundbreaking 2015 nuclear agreement, Trump's withdrawal from the deal and his institution of a maximum pressure policy have practically annihilated it. These measures have precipitated escalation between the two countries, which include the disputed Iranian attacks on oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's shooting down of an American drone, as well as the most recent declaration of Iranian enriching uranium beyond levels set by the JCPOA. Given this tense environment, a fear on the minds of all stakeholders is the possibility that these escalatory actions could cause an armed confrontation. Defenders of the Trump administration's withdrawal from the deal point towards his desire to renegotiate a seemingly better deal that addresses non-nuclear aspects of Iran's regional ambitions, mainly renegotiating the ballistic missile program and support for proxy groups throughout the region. Located in this camp of supporters of canceling and renegotiating the deal are leaders within the Trump administration cabinet and some in Congress. In the Gulf region, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, along with Bahrain, are definitely pleased to see an American president tempering their expansionist rival. The opposing camp to the withdrawal includes numerous leaders in Washington, especially in the Democratic Party, as well as many European leaders and the resource-poor Asian countries whom are nervous due to the potential disruption of the most crucial choke point for global energy supplies, the Strait of Hormuz. The Iraqis, with their fragile domestic situation and being the second largest destination for Iranian exports after China, also were against the withdrawal from the JCPOA. Then you have the neutral parties in the Gulf region that prefer to avoid conflict. Kuwait, a small state with a precarious geostrategic position surrounded by Iran, Saudi, and Iraq, surely is avoiding conflict in the region. Qatar, another small state, being isolated by its only neighboring country, blockaded by half of the GCC, and the host of Al Udeid base, is in no position for a conflict with Iran. Oman, one of the initiators of negotiations for the Iran deal and longtime friend of Iran, is also against the conflict. Yemen, caught in the crossfire between Saudi and UAE ambitions and Iranian proxy interests, are also adverse to increased conflict. Within Iran, the sanctions have arguably empowered Iranian hardliners at the expense of moderates, thanks in part to the economic challenges best typified by decreases in Iranian oil exports, which have dropped an astounding 89% over a one-year period. All camps have seemingly espoused a desire for peace, and the main actors have been posturing their defense stance, prudently avoiding offensive signals. Yet, accidentally following into war is not inconceivable in this context, and the stakes are high for everyone. On that note, we have assembled an excellent panel for you today to answer the following imperative questions. Are the United States and Iran inevitably in a collision course? How can tensions be dampened? How would the politics of a US-Iran war play out in Washington and Tehran, respectively? What are the factors that could bring the US and Iran back to the negotiating table? Could a better deal actually be negotiated? If so, who would be the mediating party? And what are the consequences of these outcomes for regional observers, such as the GCC states, Iraq, Yemen, and Israel? Essentially, who benefits from a war in the Gulf? While, as always, these questions do not have easy answers, I look forward to hearing from our excellent panel to share with us their perspectives on these issues. Without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Sigurd Noburer, non-resident fellow with Gulf International Forum and our moderator today. Everyone's bio is online, so if you want to access their details, it's available there for you. And please join me in welcoming the panel.
Thank you so much, Danya, and it is really a pleasure to be here today and to discuss this outstanding issue that I think we're all trying to figure out ourselves. And also because you have already seen the agenda, I would encourage my fellow panelists to perhaps at the end after their remarks to try to identify possible diplomatic solutions within the parameters that we're operating in at this moment of time. So without further ado, Trita, why don't you begin?
Very good. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure being here. My first time at GIF. I hope it's one of many times. I'm very impressed with what the organization has managed to achieve in a very short period of time. Sad that we have to discuss such negative circumstances, but I think quite fitting that if you take a look at what the other speakers are going to be talking about, that we start off talking about the domestic drivers of this. Not necessarily, and I might contradict myself here a little bit, not because there necessarily are strong constituencies in the United States that can be accredited for what has happened, but because at the end of the day, the conflict that we're seeing right now was initiated in this town. We had a nuclear agreement that was fully functioning. The Iranians were adhering to it, and we would not be in a situation as we are in today, in which this crisis is now putting the United States once again on the verge of war with Iran. You have scenarios with Gulf tankers being attacked. If the British account is correct, there's also an attempt by the Iranians to retaliate against the Brits for having taken one of their oil tankers in the Mediterranean, trying to do the same against a British tanker in the Persian Gulf just yesterday. We would not be in this situation in any way, shape, or form if the nuclear deal had been adhered to and if the Trump administration had actually tried to address whatever additional concerns they have within the framework of continuing diplomacy rather than shattering diplomacy for the sake, ostensibly, of a renegotiation. The question then, though, is why is this happening and who is the Trump administration responding to in order to go in this direction? And we have to recognize that we're not in any way, shape, or form a normal situation in which you have a normal functioning interagency policy process working inside the US government. You do not have a normal functioning policy on the outside in which ideas, etc., are going through various different channels and running through Congress before they actually are adopted into policy. That's not the way this town is working any longer. Frankly, there isn't much of a policy process. So we have to set aside those models in order to better understand what is taking place. And I would argue that the crisis that we're seeing today is actually not really driven by domestic grassroots audience as much as they are driven by a few individuals who have been pushing the Trump administration, including Trump himself. Trump didn't have an opinion on this matter, or in the sense of having an opinion on Iran. He had an opinion on the nuclear deal because it was Obama's nuclear deal. He ended up surrounding himself with individuals who, despite their misgivings about the deal, nevertheless counseled that he should stay in it because it would be detrimental to U.S. national interests if the United States withdrew from this deal. He was deeply frustrated by this. He just wanted to get rid of it regardless of the consequences. And then he ended up firing those individuals one by one until he got his inner team that was in agreement with the idea that you have to get rid of the nuclear team, particularly having both Pompeo and Bolton there. Now, here's what happens when you do that. It is very unlikely that you can find a set of individuals who oppose staying in the deal, who want to get out of the deal, and who at the same time were not in favor of a military confrontation with Iran. And that is what he has ended up with. Because both in the case of Bolton, certainly, who has a very long track record of seeking military confrontation with Iran, as well as someone like Pompeo, his inner circle right now is geared in that direction. And this was very visible about 2 Thursdays ago when push came to shove and Pompeo and Bolton had the opportunity of counseling restraint, and they did not. Instead, they canceled a military attack that would have left, according to Trump, 150 people dead on the Iranian side, and most likely would have led to a massive escalation beyond that. Now, beyond these individuals inside of the Trump administration and Trump himself, I think it's critical to also understand that the pressure that is coming from certain countries in the region have been absolutely decisive in order for Trump to adopt this position. And the question there is, we do know that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, of course, for quite some time had been pushing for a confrontational policy. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates said to his French counterpart in 2010 after a visit to Saudi Arabia that the Saudis want to fight the Iranians to the last American. So this is well established. The question is, to what end? What is the final purpose? What is the objective that has created this rather unlikely alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel along the lines of this form of a confrontation? And I think this is where we should have a real deep conversation, because while these countries are actually acting according to an assessment of their national interests that I think we can discuss and debate, but nevertheless, it's based on an assessment of their national interests. I'm wondering if we're having the same conversation when it comes to these issues in which we are making assessment on the basis of our national interests. Because what these countries are looking for is to rectify the changes that occurred in the region as a result of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. With that, the balance of power in the region shifted. It unleashed Iran because both Saddam and the Taliban were undone. And we have seen a development in the region since then in which Iran has been able to expand its influence and rise in power at the expense of traditional American allies whose power and position in the region were a function of America having a very strong military hegemony in the region pre-2003. This has all been destroyed because of the failure of the Iraq War, because of the cost of it, because of the instability that has followed, and because the United States increasingly have come to the at least implicit conclusion that hegemony in the Middle East is not all that was promised to be. They want the United States to shift the balance back, which means either isolating Iran in perpetuity or taking it out militarily in order to once again have a balance in the region that would give these countries the maneuverability and the standing and the protection that they had before. The question is, of course, they have no capacity to be able to shift the balance on their own. They can only do so by convincing the United States to do it for them. And again, we can have a conversation as to whether that will work, whether that is actually in the long-term interest of them, but at least it's an assessment on what would be good for them. The question that has not been asked in this town is, what's in it for the United States? What is the value of military hegemony in the Middle East, in today's Middle East, where you have already 3 collapsing states, where the value of the oil is not at all what it was 40 years ago because of shale oil explosion in the United States and other technologies? What is the real proposition of value and the cost-benefit analysis that would bring us to this point? And here's where the fascinating thing happens. If there's one person in the United States that actually at a high level has challenged this in an inconsistent, incoherent way, but nevertheless has done so, it's actually Donald Trump himself. That can go out on a tweet and say, why are we still doing this? And the next day brag about more arms sales to the Saudis and talk about obliterating Iran. So the very inconsistency and contradictions of American foreign policy that in the past was largely driven by domestic constituents, now today is driven by other factors, has all become personified in Donald Trump himself. And that brings us back to the beginning of the conversation. In order to have any form of a solution, it's always, of course, easy for the Europeans and the French to travel to Tehran and trying to see if they can get a solution. But that is actually walking away from the source of the problem. If they really want to solve it, they should come to this city. And they should have a conversation with the Trump administration and saying that in the long run, it does not lie in the interest of the United States to punish countries for adhering to a UN Security Council resolution. Because that's the situation we are in today. The United States is in violation of it, and beyond that is actually punishing countries that are trying to adhere to established international law. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hunter, you want to take up from there and
I will try.
set the context for how these new dynamics are playing out in Iran in itself?
Yes, thank you very much. As it is built in the schedule, I'm going to try to talk a bit about the domestic dynamics in Iran. But I think that what is much more important is to provide a historical context and I would for the current situation, as well as to really talk about more fundamental geopolitical issues and about Iran's what I call the geopolitical predicament that has contributed greatly to this situation, because I don't want to go to be excessively sort of schoolmarmish and try to tell the entire history. But what we basically are seeing, the current American policy is really what the British pursued towards Iran. And that was that to keep Iran, half alive. And the reason they kept Iran half alive was because of the concern about the Russian influence, the famous Great Game and the Russo-British competition. And Iran still is, despite Saudi oil and despite all these other things, Iran is the geopolitical prize in the region. It's a landmass that is between the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea, and it is high in the middle of linking Eurasia and South and Central Asia together. So I think that this is something that we have to realize. And the Americans have actually, once the British left the Middle East, especially after '68, the Americans have pursued this policy. As long as the Soviet Union was in power, and it was there, it hadn't collapsed, the American hostility to Iran, even during the first decade of the Islamic Revolution, was tempered because of the fear that the Soviets might take over Iran and also, of course, from Iran come to the Persian Gulf. It's the famous thing. This is Washington policy, and the policy of the Viceroy of India have not changed a bit. So this is one element that we have to see about Iran. The other problem with Iran and great powers in general is that Iran has a potential, unfortunately a potential which has never been realized, but has a potential to become a serious middle power. And in general, because of the characteristics of the international system and the way that the states behave, great powers don't like regional powers, particularly in places that is of high interest to them. Therefore, even during the Shah, and this is something now I am talking with my own, I am the oldest person probably in the panel, definitely, I don't think in the house, but anyway. So some of the things I'm saying is not book learning, it's something that I have witnessed personally. And so even when the Shah was supposedly an ally of America and so forth, they were ambivalent about the Shah. And several times, different American administrations, starting with the Kennedy administration, actually undermined Iran. And definitely Carter administration's policies, as Richard Cottom had said, acted as a catalyst for the Islamic Revolution. I don't want to get into that. So what I am trying to say, a degree of tension between Iran and any great power, and even Russia. I mean, at the moment, Iran is closer to Russia simply because the Americans are so, putting this. So therefore, we have to keep this, that the American problems did not occur here. The other thing that we have to understand, going beyond the current crisis, is that, in my humble opinion, America sees Iran as a country, almost as a satrapy that has rebelled and has managed to survive. In empires, emperors cannot allow satrapies rebel and survive. So the whole question, it seems to me, it is really basically to show Iran that you cannot play with the eagle's beak. We used to say with the lion's tail, but the lion's tail has become the eagle's beak, and get away with it. Now, the question becomes, therefore, and this is why U.S. policy has been, especially since 1988, when the Gorbachev reforms basically took Russia for a long time out of the geopolitical game in the Middle East, has been to force Iran to either submit to the American conditions, or look at the consequences. And the whole question of war, I mean, everybody says that Trump is much less willing to go to war. I mean, both immediately after the Iraq invasion, and that the danger of that America is going to go and attack Iran was very high. In fact, some people thought that instead of Iraq, U.S. should have attacked Iran first. I mean, this is what it is. And even during the Obama time, the same thing was. And let's not forget the crippling sanctions were imposed under the stewardship of Hillary Clinton, who actually in her memoirs takes credit for this. So the point I'm trying to say that the problems of Iran and the United States go beyond these things. Let me say if I have time, a couple of words about Iran's position in the regional context. In the region, Iran is very alone. Basically, it's a non-Arab, non-Turkic country surrounded by Turks and Arabs. Let's face it. As a result, whatever Iran does, somebody sees as expansion. I mean, I find this very strange to hear that Iran is the expansionist power after giving up Bahrain. I know that some people who said Bahrain was not Iran's to give up, but I beg to differ on a lot of things. After the Persian Gulf's name is challenged, who challenged it? Nasser started. I mean, Iranians didn't say this is an Iranian Gulf. The Persian Gulf, as the Greeks called it. And so on and so on and so forth, but Iran is the expansionist power. Every time Iran breathes, they say you are interfering. You know what I'm saying? And of course, under the Islamic Revolution, they have, in some cases, interfered, but a lot of their interferences has been reactive. Whether in Lebanon, it was after 1982 invasion, whether in Syria, after the so-called Arab Spring, in Iraq after 2003. And in the intra-Arab politics also, and the Israelis, both Israelis and Arab have used Iran as pretext for a number of things, both to counterbalance other Arabs and counterbalance Israel. For example, during the Nasser's time, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and so on, used Iran to balance Nasser and later Iraq revolutionary government and Syria and so on. Sadat used Iran to balance the Iraqis and other radical government. But Iran is affected by the dynamics of Arab politics But every time it tries to do something to secure its own interests, it's accused of interference. The many, and I'm sorry to say this in this forum, maybe I will never be invited, but that's okay. The fact is that the Arab states have a very proprietary attitude towards the Middle East. Any other thing, recently Saudi Arabia said that Iran and Turkey should not interfere in the Middle East. But how cannot they interfere in the Middle East? They live in the Middle East. Their security is affected by it happening. So it seems to me that a lot of this stuff did not stay. And now coming to the Saudi Arabia. I have always believed, except for the UAE, and UAE I think I would like to qualify. It would be unfair to put Sharjah and Dubai or even Fujairah or Ajman and so on in the same category as the UAE. Sheikh Zayed, the father, and now of course the son and the grandson or whatever, they always had a chip on their shoulder when it came to Iran. Even when the Shah was trying to protect them, they were resentful of Iran. And so were the Saudis. So all this myth about Saudi-Iranian cooperation, Saudis used Iran during the Yemen thing. I don't want to get into that, but maybe some other occasion. But the point I'm trying to say is that Iran is constrained. Whatever it does, it's considered interference. Iran is seen as an illegitimate thing. I hope I have conveyed, I know it's inadequate at the moment, but I hope I have conveyed to you that some of the problems in U.S.-Iran relations are really what I call systemic. They are not just by the actions of an Obama. Unfortunately, in America, we have a very, what I call engineering things. We think that, if we can redo everything and forget about the past and everything will be happily ever after. We will live. If Saddam goes, we will be happily ever after. If Nasser goes, we live happily now. The Shah goes, everything will be fine. And now if Khamenei goes, then, the 100 flowers will bloom and Middle East will be paradise on earth. No, this doesn't. Now, having said that, let me, to balance my sort of assessment, to talk a little bit about the problems that the Iranian leadership has. To me, the most important, and I have written this, the most important problem in Iran is that since the Islamic Revolution, Iran has not had a national government. Now, let me define what I mean by that. By that, I mean that the priorities of the Islamists in Iran, and I think even some of the so-called reformists go into that, is really this idea they have of Islam. Khamenei says he wants to create a new Islamic civilization. Well, I'm sorry, I don't want to get into that. That's too controversial. And the other thing is that for him, Palestine is the priority rather than Iran. I sympathize with the Palestinian price, but I do not believe that Iran should pay the price for the liberation of Palestine. Let the Arabs do it. Let the other Muslims do it. Iran can, contribute its share, but let the others do that. But this, for them, unfortunately, Khamenei, I really resent the fact that they wear this Chafiya constantly, and every time he hardly ever refers to the nation of Iran. They only talk about Millat-e-Iran, nation of Iran, when they are in trouble and when they want to, excite resistance and so on, as, for example, recently. Otherwise, it's Ummat-e-Islam, and everything in the name of Islam. This is the major problem of the Iranian system. They don't think in terms of Iran's national interest. Qasem Soleimani doesn't care about Iran. I'm sorry. Azerbaijan tomorrow might secede, and they are concerned about the Golan Heights. To me, this is a misplaced order of priorities. But more important, however, is that the Iranian state is an ideological state. And because of the ideological nature of it, the power of the current ruling elite depends on that. If we were not so stupid as allow the Shah to disappear, a monarchy can always become a constitutional monarchy, but an ideological state cannot. Look at the USSR. It finally collapsed because that was the relationship. So the problem, therefore, becomes this. Unfortunately, confrontation with America has become the cornerstone of the legitimacy of the Iranian state. And the less successful the Iranian state is in providing what the Iranian people need, the more important this notion that we are independent and so on. But independence for what? I always say that the Iranian independence is like the freedom, in Janis Joplin's song, freedom is another word for nothing left to lose. Independence is another word for nothing left to lose, But the other thing I have to say that unfortunately US policy since the 1990s, or actually since the 1980s, since the end of the Iran-Iraq war, has contributed to the gradual shift of power to the hardliners. The best time to improve relations with Iran was immediately after 1988 ceasefire. I think I'm going to have to cut. I think that you have been very patient with me if you want to answer that. So the problem that is that what can be done? Since you said just 30 seconds, what can be done? What can be done to avoid a catastrophe is that this mentality of that the choice between war or submission has to be avoided on both sides, Iran and they should not see that so much that national pride is engaged in this. I think actually from Emmanuel Macron's idea of stopping, with stopping is a good thing, and that might set the stage for future talks. To do this would be, to begin with, U.S. should lift at least some of the restriction on oil. I think that is what the Iranians are most concerned about, because really, they can't have. Did an interview some time ago, which was to be published in an academic journal. I was told that they cannot publish it because they don't have paper. So really, that's what it is. So there can be done, because otherwise this situation is going to lead to conflict. And believe me, the Iranian hardliners are not like the Shah. They are not going to flee and let the others take over. They will fight. They will fight, and they will fight in the spirit of a kind of a Masada spirit, or the Samson spirit. If we are going down, we are going to bring the temple down. So we have all to do what we can to prevent this calamity from happening, and then from then on, see we can reason both with Washington and Tehran to unlock this very long, ongoing problem. Thank you.
So, Dr. Saji, you want to pick up the conversation from here and perhaps stake out some of the dynamics within the Gulf, but because we already have touched in the introduction a little bit about the cleavage existing in the Gulf on the issue of Iran, perhaps you would be able to continue to identify some of the solutions perhaps within the Gulf and within the present framework in the region. So, yeah, please take it from there.
Thank you, Sig. Thank you very much for the Gulf International Forum for the invitation. And I heard Professor Hunter speaking just now finishing. And the Gulf dynamics, unfortunately, if I have the answers, we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place. But this is the cruelty of the lack of indigenous balance of power that we are going through. And our region has been really bedeviled for eternity, it seems, for lack of indigenous balance of power. Because of that, there is heavy reliance on outsourcing of our security. And we wish that Iran has really come to a decision to transfer itself from a revolution to a state. You're dealing with a revolution and with a unique state that is not really a normal state to deal with. You have the supreme leader, Al-Murshid, You have a country that is really going through a major transition with the crunch now with the sanctions. You have a lack of confidence between both sides of our region and the Gulf. You have the flip-flopping of the American relations with Iran for over the last 40 years, and we are paying the price for it. The Americans, the Bush administration, when they toppled Saddam Hussein's regime, and before that the Taliban on the east and Saddam Hussein on the west, Iran was really jubilant. Iran seized the opportunity and the moment and tried to advance its project. The problem with the Iranian project, every major country in the world, international relations, it's based on interest and power. And Iran is really playing that to the hilt. Iran utilized its power and spread its wings, dominating in its expansion. And I disagree with the esteemed colleague, Dr. Hunter. Iran is an expansionist, hegemonic country, and I don't blame Iran. If I were Iran, I probably would do the same thing, but not with a sectarian and theological twist to it. This is the problem with Iran. The problem with Iran is that it looks at itself as it thinks, or it wants to project itself as the spokesperson of Islam, and this is not the case. Even Iran does not speak on behalf of all Shias in the Muslim world, because many Shias don't subscribe to the theology of the Wilayat al-Faqih that has been exercised in Iran with a few other Arab states or Islamic states, led by Hezbollah probably in Lebanon. That's it. Even Shia in Lebanon don't subscribe to the Wilayat al-Faqih version of theology in Shia Islam. So the problem with Iran is that the opportunity came instead of fostering a good neighborly relation with the GCC countries. We saw Iran that used the opportunity that provided for it to expand its wings in the region. And then boasting under Obama administration, Obama gave Iran all the whole region to just mess up and with its shenanigans. They dominated Iraq, they dominated Syria, they're even sending militias, Shia militias to fight with Assad, who is a secular. I mean, this is the contradiction of Iran. It presents itself as a religious theology in Shia Islam, which is a minority sect in Islam, wants to speak on behalf of all Muslims, and then supports a secular regime in Syria. This is the contradiction of Iran. When the Arab Spring spread all over the Arab world, they lauded the Iranians, the supreme leader. This is really an inspirational movement led by the Iranian Revolution. Wow. But when it comes to Syria, it is a conspiracy. It's a Western conspiracy to undermine the muqawama, the resistance bloc, or the resistance axis. This is now, Iran has lost really credibility, not in the Gulf region, but even in the wider Arab world. Even Hezbollah lost credibility. I remember in 2006, when Hezbollah was hammered by the Israelis in the last war between Israel and Hezbollah, in many Sunni streets and countries, they were rallying behind Nasrallah because he stood up to the Israelis, and he was a hero, even in Sunni world. But then, when the Arab Spring came and the Iranians supported a thuggish regime in Syria that's killing and obliterating its own people and jumping in with Hezbollah, that was the hero of the Arab and Muslim world, Iran lost all credibility, and Hezbollah lost whatever left of his credibility. So the problem with Iran is that it's project that is dominating the region. And then you have the Obama administration behind our back struck a deal starting with secret negotiations in Muscat, in Oman, in 2012, and then the deal came, and then the flop, and I agree with Trump in a very rare moment, I agree with Trump that President Trump, that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was flawed from the get-go. Flawed in the sense that it keeps the Iranian program, just freezes it, does not have a strict version of inspection, does not include the ballistic missiles program, And what's important for us in our midst is that it does not really curtail and put into a freezer also the Iranian hegemonic tendency, intervention in our region, and with malign intervention that is really spreading sectarianism and undermining our stability and security. So Iran is not practicing a good neighborly relationship. And then Iranian with all different stripes, from the mullahs to the Revolutionary Guard to even members of parliament. I remember they were boasting, oh, look, we control now 4 Arab capitals under our thumb. What do you expect us to do? They control Iraq. All the exiles now, the cabinet members and the leaders of all political parties were exiled during the Saddam's era in Iran. They control Syria. They control Hezbollah and Lebanon. And they control the Houthis. So then they have also intervention in Kuwait. We discovered in 2015 in Kuwait the largest and most threatening cell that was planning to topple to play havoc in Kuwait by arming, by supporting, by indoctrinating these Shi'i Kuwaitis with an Iranian master to try to undermine the stability of Kuwait, which has a good relationship or a working relationship and liaisoning between the GCC states and Iran. If you would do that to the country that is very dovish in your relationship with, so what are you going to do about the hawkish countries that you have problems with? Well, that by itself really does not instill any confidence or what we call it confidence building measures from the Iranians towards on the other side of the Arabian Gulf. So because of that, we have a problem. Now, if we fast forward to this crisis, the escalation, de-escalation, we are bystanders.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sashi. I'm sorry, we're going to leave it here because we're running a little short of time, and we have Dr. Abbas Kadhim next. But during the Q&A session, perhaps you could go into detail a little bit about what happened in 2015 between Kuwait and Iran. I think that's an issue that is not widely understood.
I just want to finish. Allow me 1 minute on it. Now we are witnessing Cold War between the two sides of the Gulf. We don't have a united front representing the GCC. Even before the GCC current crisis, the Gulf countries, the GCC countries, were not really on the same page vis-a-vis Iran. We have the hawks, we have the doves, and that was really came to play very clearly when the Iranian mobs under the Iranian regime guys, and probably looking the other way, attacked and ransacked the Saudi embassy in Tehran and its general consulate in Mashhad, the Saudis' southern relations with the Bahrainis. All other GCC states lowered and pulled out their ambassadors, even Qatar did it. And then from there on, from 2016 onward, things really went down. Then probably in the Q&A I could reply to some answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kadhim, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the Gulf International Forum for this timely event. And it's an honor to be with this panel. Let me talk about Iraq. I'm not going to go into a lot of, the complain back parts, but just really talk about it in terms of what the question was, what the stakes for Iraq are. And it's very important. I think, constructive analysis is what is needed rather than just repeating, ages-old grievances that have taken the region nowhere, unfortunately. Iraq just emerged out of a very vicious war against a terrorist group, ISIS, and it emerged victorious. But with all of this victory, Iraq emerged very bruised, with a lot of challenges. economic, political, social, you name it. And Iraq is right now probably is in a more dangerous stage than it was when it was fighting ISIS when 1/3 of the territory was lost, because there was a consensus that Iraqis had a common enemy and they needed to unite, forget everything, and then defeat that enemy. Now that it is defeated, we are back towards the inner conflict over how to slice the Iraqi pie and who gets what, and that is very important. Also, the post-conflict challenges are very important to reckon with. Iraq needs a great amount of money to rebuild. We are about almost 3 years after the liberation of the war-torn regions or provinces, and they are still standing in ruins. And if that doesn't change, the victory that Iraq accomplished, impressive as it is, it might turn into some form of a Pyrrhic victory that the cost of it is more than the pleasure that one gets from emerging victorious from a conflict. Iraq had a bill in the post-ISIS era of somewhere around $88 billion. That is about the annual revenue Iraq gets from its only resource, which is oil. Iraq is almost 100% dependent on oil. Whatever augmentation they have for their budget is more of a loans and some other menial kind of small contributions to the budget from other sources. And much of what Iraq can accomplish is untapped. In 2017, Dr. Ali Allawi, Dr. Lu'il Khatib, who is currently the Minister of Electricity, and myself put together a 10-year plan for Iraq. Took us 3 years to write it, and we argued that by 2028, Iraq needs to generate $500 billion annually to be able to operate the state and pay the bills for infrastructural reconstruction, and also putting together an economy that can take the pressure out of the state, and which is right now the only employer that people look up to, and create other opportunities for people. Where do you get that from? The current $88 billion that they generate from oil, about $420 billion. They need to figure out how to activate the other sectors that are not activated. How do they do that? They need to have stability. They do need to have reconstruction. They need to have also reconstruction with the capital R, just reconstruction of a nation, not just rebuilding the destroyed houses and roads and all of that. So a lot of work. Then on top of it comes this looming crisis between Iran and the United States. Now, what does it mean if a conflict? I happen to be probably the most optimistic person at this table. I don't think war will occur from what I see and from what I've seen in terms of U.S. Building for war in the previous times. You know, I come from Iraq, and we've seen several wars and how the preparations for that. I don't see the preparations for war, at least until now. So it is, and that's good if I am right. But my talk is in case I'm wrong. So what Iraq looks at the crisis basically is that Iraq is an ally for both countries, the United States and Iran. Iraq cannot afford not to be an ally of Iran. And Iraq cannot afford also not to be a strong ally of the United States. And that is important. The reason why Iran is getting the upper hand in Iraq is because Iran cares about Iraq more than the U.S. cares about Iraq. The U.S. can afford losing Iraq. Iran cannot. All right? And that is important. That's why I think we do see Iran getting a better hold on inside Iraqi politics, inside Iraqi. So, and all you need to know if you see the comparisons, just compare the visits U.S. officials make to Iraq and the visit Iranian officials make. We read about U.S. visits, whether it's the president or the Secretary of State or others. We read about it after it happens, and it's always in secrecy and all of that. While the Iranian Foreign Affairs Minister would just bring the press and the TV and rides the plane and says, I am going to Iraq, and then goes there, spends 5 days and meets everybody there. And then, that is important, I think, to see. And I think it is the two countries are having different attitudes toward Iraq, and that's the advantage goes to Iran in this case. But from an Iraqi perspective, both countries are important, and I think Iraq cannot succeed if it will have to choose between either Iran or Iraq because of the geopolitical situation with Iran and because, again, the role the U.S. has played in Iraq. So the ideal way for Iraq is to have either the two countries work their differences in a better way, or get Iraq out of the conflict and just duke it out somewhere else. And that is important also. Iraq also is a country that adopts neutrality as a foreign policy. And that is not just a policy preference, it is a constitutional mandate. The Iraqi government is probably one of the few, if any, other countries that have a constitutional mandate that they cannot enter into alliances. I mean, think about, you put in your constitution, of course, with pressures mostly from the U.S. when the Constitution was written, that Iraq cannot be seen as threatening to other neighbors or even entering into alliances where they are in one camp against another. And that's why Iraq cannot be with Saudi against Iran in any conflict, and cannot be with Iran against Saudi or the United States or any country on the planet. That is a constitutional mandate for the government. It's not a choice. It so happens also, knowing and getting to talk to a lot of top Iraqi officials, is that they prefer that as well. They don't want to be into alliances where Iraq is not necessarily part of these bilateral conflicts that they have around in the region or beyond. But the question is, can Iraq keep this neutrality? And that is really the big question. That's why the Iraqis are very nervous as the calculations get closer to war, because Iraqi government fears a great deal that a non-state actor inside Iraq can drag Iraq into a conflict. There are so many groups in Iraq that do not adhere to the Iraqi government authority. There is a lot of weaponry that is scattered. Most of it is not under the control of the state. And there are certain groups that if a war or a conflict happens between the U.S. and Iran, they will they made it clear that they will side with Iran and they will target U.S. interests in Iraq. That means the United States will probably have to retaliate against them or against other, brings Iraq into the battleground as it will be extended. And that is very bad for Iraq because, again, the good news so far is that pre-conflict there is a consensus among Iraqis, including the groups that are not reporting to the Iraqi government. They do not want to do anything to bring conflict. But if conflict occurs, then that consensus will be lost and Iraq will be split among those who will act with Iran and those who will act towards neutrality, which means basically neutrality will be shattered, and that is important. Also, war, if it happens, or conflict, if it drags and it becomes really more encompassing than just small-scale conflict, if Hormuz is closed, well, guess what I just told you earlier. Entire budget of Iraq is oil, and all of that oil gets out of Hormuz. So it is just like you are having a shop on a little street, and on both ends of the street there is a fight and customers will not come to you. Iraq cannot afford losing a penny because they need every penny they can get and 4 times more to be able to survive for the next time. They need to rebuild their electricity. They need to do a lot of things in all of this. So, and then that's another thing where we talk about why Iraq will have to deal with Iran. It gets its electricity, its fuel from Iran. Just mentioned, Dr. Dhafar said correctly that Iran is also comes after China when it comes to the trade exchange, and so many other things that Iraq is, and there is no alternative. So stability is at stake for Iraq. The opening of Hormuz is vital, not just for Iraq, but there are other countries. Kuwait, for example, has another issue like that, and Qatar and others who need that for their livelihood. And then also Iraq needs stability and needs no conflict, because post-conflict reconstruction has to be done in a stable, calm environment. And Iraq needs that internal consensus that they are having right now, because, again, a conflict will divide the Iraqi society between those, and also not just the society, but the leadership, to be frank, between those who want Iraq to side with Iran and those who want Iraq to side with the neutrality policy they have. But, if you look at the Iraqis, and to be honest with you, I mean, they also are nervous if something happens and then maybe Iran gets to be out of the equation. For many Iraqis that I speak with, and that's not necessarily my opinion, but it is really what prevails in Iran, just like Iran is from one argument that there is a need to contain Iranian intentions, whatever that is. But there is also an argument inside Iraq that Iran is needed to contain the other side's encroachment. Because if Iran is not there, guess who will get the upper hand in Iraq? It will be Saudi Arabia.